Imagine your city suddenly goes into lockdown. Chains hang from the gates. Barrels of vinegar stand at crossroads, and ships are kept at anchor for 40 days, forbidden to let a single soul step ashore. All of this is an attempt to defend against an enemy no one can see. This is how Europe tried to survive the most terrifying pandemic of the Middle Ages, the Black Death. You are watching Shadows of History. Here, we don't just tell you what happened, we take you there, into the shadows of events, where you can hear the cries of the streets, the toll of funeral bells, and the silence of abandoned cities. Today, we will uncover how people in the 14th century struggled to survive, what measures they believed in, and how those desperate choices shaped the future of Europe. The arrival of death. When the Black Death swept into Europe in 1347, it moved faster than anyone could comprehend. Ships carried not just goods, but death. Entire crews arrived sick, covered in swellings, their bodies failing within days. In the streets of Messina, Genoa, and Marseille, people collapsed where they stood. Families locked their doors in terror, hoping the plague would pass them by. What made this horror worse was ignorance. No one understood infection. No one had the faintest idea of bacteria or fleas. Explanations filled the void. Some saw it as divine punishment. Others blamed poisoned air, corrupted by earthquakes or eclipses. There were even rumors that strangers and minorities had poisoned wells. And from every theory, new survival strategies emerged. The struggle for clean air. If the air was poisoned, then air had to be cleansed. That was the logic. Streets filled with the smell of burning herbs. Juniper, rosemary, sage, and frankincense were set ablaze in city squares, filling the night with smoke and sparks. Families hung cloths soaked in vinegar across their windows. Some carried sponges or cloths pressed to their noses, dripping with aromatic oils. Doctors, too, adopted this logic. They recommended carrying pomanders, small metal spheres filled with spices. These were clutched in hand or worn on chains, tiny shields against an invisible enemy. Wealthy households filled their halls with incense, believing the smoke itself could drive away death. Medicine in the dark. Medieval medicine was built on the theory of humors, the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If disease struck, it meant imbalance. The cure? Bleeding the patient. Doctors applied leeches, opened veins, or prescribed purges. Some insisted on diets, no raw fruits, no bathing, no sleep during the day. The treatments were painful, often fatal, but families clung to them. To do nothing was unthinkable. The image of the plague doctor in the bird-like mask did not yet exist in the 14th century. That came much later. In this first wave, physicians wore little more than long robes, cloaks, and cloth masks. They entered homes heavy with stench, holding sticks to examine patients without touching them. For their courage, many of them paid with their lives. Quarantine, a harsh invention. The most effective survival strategy came not from prayers or smoke, but from cold calculation, quarantine. The idea was born in Italian ports. At first, ships were held for 30 days, a Trentino. But when 30 was not enough, they extended it to 40, a quarantina. 40 days before anyone could set foot on land. Venice created lazarettos, quarantine islands. Sailors, merchants, and travelers suspect of illness were locked away, guarded by soldiers, given meager rations, and left to wait. Many died there, alone and forgotten. But these measures worked. Cities that embraced quarantine saw fewer deaths. Trade suffered, but life continued. Survival in the streets. Life in plague-stricken cities was a nightmare. Markets, once crowded and noisy, fell silent. Vendors who still dared to sell goods did so behind tables, extending bread or meat with long poles, never touching a buyer's hand. Coins were dropped into bowls of vinegar before being accepted. The smell of rot mixed with vinegar, smoke, and fear. Houses were sealed shut. If an entire family died, the door was nailed closed and marked. Streets became graveyards, where wagons carried the bodies of the dead, piled high, covered with lime, and dumped into mass pits. Survivors walked quickly, eyes down, clutching amulets, whispering prayers. The psychology of fear. Fear reshaped society. Neighbors no longer greeted each other. Friends avoided meetings. Families abandoned the sick, sometimes locking them inside to die. Chroniclers tell of mothers leaving children and children deserting parents. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, wrote, "One citizen fled from another, a neighbor from his neighbors, a relative from his relatives, and even brothers abandoned brothers and parents abandoned their children." But not all abandoned compassion. Some risked everything to care for others: monks who brought water, women who nursed the sick, neighbors who buried the dead. Many perished, but their sacrifices offered rare glimpses of humanity in a time of terror. Religion and desperation. Religion became both refuge and danger. Many believed the plague was God's punishment for sin. Flagellants, bands of men who whipped themselves in public, marched through towns, chanting prayers, their backs bleeding. They believed their suffering would earn divine mercy. People joined them, hoping for salvation. But wherever they gathered, plague spread faster. Monasteries closed their gates, isolating themselves. Priests died administering last rites. Some people prayed constantly, while others lost all faith, declaring God had abandoned them. A few even surrendered to vice, drunken feasts, debauchery, crime, believing that if death was certain, they might as well enjoy their final days. Across the regions, responses varied across Europe. In Italy, strict quarantine and lazarettos became the main defense. In France and Germany, religious processions and pogroms erupted. Minority groups, especially Jews, were accused of poisoning wells. Entire communities were massacred, but the plague did not stop. In England, the wealthy fled cities, retreating to country estates. Peasants trapped in villages suffered both disease and famine. In Scandinavia, villages blocked roads, posting guards to prevent strangers from entering. Isolation became their shield. Each region, each city developed its own strategies. Some worked, many did not. But everywhere, the struggle for survival reshaped daily life. Inside the home, survival was about small details. Families created clean rooms, separating food and water from the sick. They hung curtains around beds, turning them into small tents to trap warmth and, they hoped, safety. At night, families huddled together under heavy wool blankets and furs, often sleeping in the same bed. Food became both nourishment and medicine. Hot soups, garlic, spiced wine, and boiled water were consumed endlessly. Some believed garlic could ward off death. Others trusted in onions, vinegar, or crushed emeralds. Every remedy, no matter how strange, offered a fragile hope. Violence and scapegoats. As fear deepened, so did cruelty. When cures failed, people looked for someone to blame. In many cities, Jews were accused of spreading plague. Rumors spread of poisoned wells. Entire communities were burned alive or driven out. Healers, beggars, and foreigners were attacked. The violence solved nothing. It only added human blood to the toll of disease. Lessons in survival. And yet, in the chaos, lessons emerged. Cities that enforced strict quarantines lost fewer people. Villages that isolated themselves often survived while their neighbors perished. Families that burned the belongings of the dead reduced their risk. It was not medicine or prayer, but isolation, discipline, and adaptation that offered the best chance. People learned, slowly, painfully, that survival was not about strength or wealth, but about caution, order, and adaptation. And yet, in the chaos, lessons emerged. Cities that enforced strict quarantines lost fewer people. Villages that isolated themselves often survived while their neighbors perished. Families that burned the belongings of the dead reduced their risk. It was not medicine or prayer, but isolation, discipline, and adaptation that offered the best chance. People learned slowly, painfully, that survival was not about strength or wealth, but about caution, order, and adaptation. And yet, in the chaos, lessons emerged. Cities that enforced strict quarantines lost fewer people. Villages that isolated themselves often survived while their neighbors perished. Families that burned the belongings